Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company which I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide. Our first 2025 tour is now live for bookings, titled Anne and Elizabeth, Mother, Daughter, Traitors, Queens. This incredible 8-day-long in-person experience will take in many of the most significant historic sites in England, from Hampton Court Palace to Hatfield House, the Tower of London to Hever Castle, featuring historians including Professor Simon Thurley, CBE, Dr. Elizabeth Norton and Illyri Lynn. To discover more and secure your place on this tour, just head to simplytudortours.com. Dr. Nikki Clark is a historian and lecturer at Chichester University. She joins me today for a fascinating discussion about Anne Boleyn's household, from who made up Anne's retinue, what roles they played, how these came about, and how things changed as Anne ascended through the court of Henry VIII before her momentous fall in May 1536. We discuss specific members of the court who served Anne, some of which are well known to us, like Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, while others are all but forgotten by history, but all played a role in serving the woman who the late Eric Ives described as the most influential queen consort in English history. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 43, The Household of Anne Boleyn, with Dr. Nikki Clark. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Dr. Nikki Clark. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very well, thank you.
Good stuff. So we're here today to talk about something that I'm really interested to learn more about, which is Anne Boleyn's household. But before we get into that, just a few questions to get to know you a bit better for those who may not know your work and what you do. So can you just provide us with a sort of short intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Sure. I feel like I'm in a job interview. So I grew up in Middlesex and then in Surrey. I went to university at the University of Kent as an undergrad and then to Royal Holloway for Masters and PhD. And I now work as an academic at the University of Chichester part-time, and I write and research and give talks and whatnot as a freelance historian for the rest of my time. And I spend most of my time in the Tudor period, but I kind of cross that cusp between medieval and early modern. So a lot of my teaching, I sort of teach anything from about 1000 to about 1600 in a kind of generic social history way. I write and teach a lot about women's history, that kind of thing.
It's funny, isn't it? I tend to find with a lot of historians, the Tudors seems to sort of draw people in, and then you people go one of two ways. They either go backwards through to the Plantagenets or they go towards the Stuarts. But what sparked your passion for Tudor history in particular? Can you remember a sort of a moment from your childhood?
Yeah, it's really cliche. They always are, though, aren't they? Colouring in pictures of the six wives in year 6.
I remember the same thing.
I guess I'd have been about 10 and learning the whole divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived rhyme. And then as a teen, I read a lot of generic Tudor history books and wondered where all the women who weren't queens were. As a first-year undergrad, I remember I went through that stereotypical obsession with Anne Boleyn. And I read George Bernard's articles suggesting she might have been guilty of at least something. And at that point, as an 18-year-old, that blew my mind. Yeah. I loved the fact that it was possible to question supposedly like solid beliefs or think, urban myths and things like that by actually getting into the archives and looking at the original source material from a new perspective.
Yeah, I mean, George definitely is one of those quite contentious historians, isn't he? Because of what he thinks about
Well, he is, and yet in person, not at all. None of it's personal for him. So he's a real quintessential historian in that way. I think the Tudors create a lot of passion, don't they? But really, history as we understand it and the practice of history, we should be aiming for some degree of objectivity. So, yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I had, I mean, sort of, I suppose more controversially, I had Illyri Lynn on the podcast a few weeks ago, and she said that she actually thinks there might be something in Anne and George Boleyn.
Really?
Yeah, and she wasn't, she didn't say that she thought they did, but she wondered whether it had been talked about as a way of potentially producing a child. And I politely said, I disagree with you, I'm sorry, but, you know, that's to your point that we know everyone, that there should be a certain amount of objectivity for certain. If you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you can jump in a time travel machine, what would it be?
There's a point in the late 1530s where the Queen's household has been dissolved. So I guess it must be after Jane Seymour's death. And one of her maids of honour, Anne Bassett, has been temporarily sent to her cousin, the Countess of Sussex's household. And that's because when Jane died, the household was kind of disbanded and scattered because no queen, there's no need for a queen's household. But Anne's family lived in Calais. And no one thought it would be all that long before there was a new queen. So she was just sent around to relatives in the meantime. And according to family letters, there's some kind of altercation between the Countess and between Anne. Anne got pretty seriously told off from all sides. And the Countess of Sussex forgave her, but somebody wrote, "I perceive she hath not forgotten." I'd just really love to know what went down, because we don't know. They don't write anything more specific. But I'd love to know if Anne had just, you know, been throwing her weight around out of frustration and the Countess had had enough.
It's definitely one of those things you wouldn't just, you'd never be able to get to the bottom of without actually seeing it in person. Do you have a Tudor pet peeve? Is there something that just really gets on your nerves about maybe misconceptions of the Tudors? You know, is there a pet peeve that you have?
Yeah, kind of. But this might be the point where I turn all your listeners against me. My pet peeve is probably that a lot of the stuff that is out there for public consumption about the Tudors is quite samey. We hear about the same historical figures, the same events, the same places. And, you know, you have to respect the love and enthusiasm for a subject, of course. But I'm just not sure I understand the kind of the fixations that you do tend to see. I got into history because I wanted to add to what we know. I don't think I ever want to write a book if I have nothing new to say or nothing new to write about. So I guess that would be my pet peeve.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, we're kind of going against what, you know, you're here today to talk about Anne Boleyn's household, and I suppose the contradiction there is that we're talking about Anne Boleyn, and she is almost very oversaturated. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm really looking forward to Firebrand, the upcoming film, because it's not about Anne Boleyn. You know, it's about one of the wives who is lesser discussed. To your point, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can't wait to watch that either.
Yeah, I just wish they'd confirm a bloody UK release date. Like, it's out in America at the end of this week. It's out.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, they just haven't confirmed a UK release.
Oh, I see. Really? I'm still busy waiting for Bridgerton.
Oh, yeah, my sister goes nuts for Bridgerton. I've never got into it, but my sister goes nuts for it.
I never got into Downton Abbey.
Oh, I loved Downton Abbey. I loved it. But yeah, but as I've said, we are here primarily today to talk about Anne Boleyn's household. To start, I'd be curious to know when Anne Boleyn, well, if we have this information available, when she first arrived back in England in 1522, she takes part in the famous Chateau Vert pageant. She took up a position in the household of Catherine of Aragon. Now, Anne was, in her own right, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and as such, did she have, at that point, did she actually have anyone reporting into her? Did she have any women serving her at all at this stage?
That's a really good question. Most women at court did also have their own servants, and normally numbers of servants were linked to social rank rather than the position you held within the household, although those did tend to broadly correspond. Trying to pin down numbers is not always that easy. Lists of women and numbers of servants that got made for special occasions seem to suggest that every maid of honour is allowed one servant. It's not clear whether that servant would be a woman or a man. But lists in ordinances a little bit earlier suggest that the six maids of honor, because there's usually six maids of honor, would have a kind of collective number of servants that they're allowed. So it is hard to know how many each individual had for herself. It is reasonable to think that Anne may well have had one female servant of her own, because just thinking about getting dressed, most Tudor costume that women are wearing at this point, you can't put it on by yourself. So you're going to need some help.
Yeah, I mean, and that would, I suppose, in a way also provide Anne with good experience. Well, not that she would have known it necessarily at the time, but also gave her good experience for what was to come as well. So once Anne Boleyn caught the attention of King Henry VIII, how quickly did she begin to assemble a group of what I would imagine was primarily women around her? Sort of how quickly did she actually start building out a household?
It's difficult to tell from the source material, because what was happening officially and what's happening unofficially were often two different things. And then what survives written down is often like a third thing yet again. The earliest reference to Anne being given her own set of lodgings apart from the rest of the maids, and therefore you presume a larger group of servants that would include women, is in 1528. But we don't have any details apart from that she was in a separate set of lodgings. The earliest references to actual names of women who were explicitly in Anne's service wasn't until the New Year gift list of 1532. And again, there's only 5 of them. So in terms of actual evidence, it's quite late. But that's not to say that people weren't starting to flock around her a little bit sooner than that.
Would have that been exclusively female, or were there also some men that would have been serving Anne at this time?
Possibly some. A household is not usually exclusively female. And obviously men are not going to be helping her get dressed in the morning. But she probably did have men in her service. She might also have used family servants. So there's a reference in the King's Privy Purse accounts in December 1529 for a reward that he paid to George Taylor, who was described there as the servant to the Lady Anne. But the same George Taylor is also mentioned in Anne's father Thomas Boleyn's own accounts a year later in 1530. So it might be that he's not specifically in Anne's service, but he's attached to the Boleyn family as a whole.
Yeah, and I imagine that, and again, without wanting to sort of make generalisations about the roles of men and women at the time, I imagine that things like, had she had horses, for example, then the horsemaster probably would have been a man. For example, if she had hounds, it probably would have been a man.
Yes, but at court, those things will be looked after by the people in charge of the stables at court. When you come to court as a woman, you bring your kind of personal servant or small group of servants with you, but that probably won't include like your own stable people, because there's plenty of them on the court's roster already.
I imagine that once Anne is elevated to the nobility, when she's made Marquess of Pembroke, that her household then would have jumped up quite considerably. Is that the case based on what you're able to find from the records?
Annoyingly, we don't know. Those kind of nice, neat, detailed accounts just don't exist at that point. I think it's probable, purely by dint of her social rank going up, a marquess at court ordinarily is allowed a greater number of servants than, say, a maid of honor. So yes, presumably. But Anne's status is in such a weird space at this point that there's no real precedent for that. So she is a marquess, the male title. So therefore, does she get the male number of servants rather than the number a marchioness would have, which is the female equivalent? Or because she is effectively queen in waiting at this point, is there something else going on? It's all a bit weird. And I think people at the time thought that it was a bit weird as well. And they didn't necessarily know exactly how to treat Anne or exactly what her status was.
Yeah, I imagine it would be, if we were to look at the household of, say, someone like Margaret Pole, who's obviously the Countess of Salisbury in her own right, that might give us some indication, just based on the fact that, again, this was, the only other really notable peeress in her own right alongside Anne Boleyn was Margaret Pole. So that might be a way of trying to get a sense on the scale of her household at the time. But a marquess was more senior than a countess, so again, it might be difficult to even pin that down.
Well, and also Margaret Pole, certainly by this point, wasn't routinely at court. So she had her own household, but it's down, I think it's in Sussex, isn't it, at Warblington?
Yeah, Warblington.
And so what it takes to kind of run a big house and estate and whatnot is not the same as Anne, for instance, being at court with a whole kind of royal household full of servants who deal with things like cooking for you,
Yeah.
and stuff like that. So yeah, it's probably not directly equivalent. There probably are some similarities. So far as I know, there aren't any surviving household accounts for Margaret
There
Pole.
are. I've written a book about her.
Oh, there are. There we go.
Yeah, I've got my first book's coming out next month, actually. It's about
Oh, cool. Congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, it comes out at the end of July, and it's about the rise and fall of the Pole family. So not just Margaret; it's looking at the whole Pole family. And yeah, that comes out next month. And there's not a huge amount, but there are records, and we know how large Margaret's household was, and the different roles therein. We have enough to be able to say very confidently that she had a big household and what those different roles were, which is good. With Anne Boleyn's household, so can you run us through typically some of the roles that were fulfilled, by gentlewomen? What were they actually doing? You've mentioned helping Anne dress. What were the key sort of functions of the roles that were filled at that time?
So yes, if she had ladies in waiting or female servants, then yes, part of their job is to help her get dressed, to look after her clothes and her jewels and things like that. They might be writing letters for her, unless she has her own secretary, which she might well have done, but they might still do that. They are probably greeting people at the door, taking in gifts, rewarding the bearers, things like that. A lot of kind of small tasks that Anne then doesn't have to do herself. And like other ladies in waiting, the job of female servants really is to accompany their mistress wherever she's going, whatever she's doing, a lot of the time, which I think sometimes could probably be very boring and sometimes really full on. I think it's 0 to 60 really fast. Other roles, I mean, they're not dissimilar from the household of a queen. There's a complete list of royal household roles from about 1540 that suggests that the queen has got about 100 people in her household. And that includes the men who are on her council who manage her estates. So she's got lawyers, she's got an attorney and a surveyor and things like that. She's also got spiritual people. So she has a series of chaplains who are there to listen to her confession, pray with her, things like that. She'll also have her own almoner, whose job it is to distribute alms, and he's very often a clergyman. She'll have a physician and an apothecary in case she's sick. And then you've got people who are doing the kind of the organisational things. So the Lord Chamberlain of her household, his deputy, her master of the horse, so he goes with her whenever she hunts, things like that. And then you've got, you kind of go down a social hierarchy. You've then got people who do more menial tasks. So you've got cup bearers who hold her cup for her to drink, grooms and pages and messengers and things like that. So yeah, the household of a noblewoman or a queen, it is almost like a machine around her that just keeps all the things of daily life and things of business going.
What can you expand on the role of a Lord Chamberlain? What actually was involved? I mean, my understanding of it is that they were in effect the manager, for want of a better word.
Pretty much. I think it must have been a bit like managing a hotel. In some cases, the Lord Chamberlain becomes quite an honorific position, and most of the daily work is actually done by the Vice Chamberlain. But it's things like if someone in the household misbehaves, then they'll be hauled before the Lord Chamberlain who sorts that out. They are the ones who take oaths of service and oaths of loyalty. I think they're the ones giving the orders as well. So the Queen says, we're doing this today. It's up to the Lord Chamberlain to then tell everybody what they need to do in order to make that happen. Things like that.
Did Anne tend to promote and give sort of greater favour to members of her own family and extended kin?
Yes, she did. All the queens did this, but I think most people did this as well. But this would have been more in what we might call the upstairs part of the household. She hasn't got family members cooking for her in the kitchen, I mean, that's too menial for them. But she does have family members as her ladies in waiting or on her council. So her chancellor is James Boleyn, who's one of her uncles, for example. A number of her ladies in waiting are relations as well. And I find it really interesting that earlier on, those tend to be Boleyns rather than Howards. So Anne is a Boleyn, but her mother was a Howard. The Howards are a much more exalted family. They're this huge dynasty. They're not quite as kind of ancient nobility as they like to think that they are, but they are Dukes of Norfolk, which is the number one peerage underneath the royal ones. And the Boleyns are kin, but also clients to the Howards. And really, until Anne's coronation, there's not all that much sign of Howards around Anne or in her service. And my hunch is that they're hedging their bets. Like, they're not going to really throw their lot in with her until she is more or less sat on that throne. So the first time you really start to see them is in October 1532, when she and the king take their trip to Calais. And Anne is very insulted because none of the French noblewomen or queens will meet with her because, well, she's just the mistress, etc. And so she arranges this banquet where she and some of her women come in a disguise and dance with the King of France and with some of his gentlemen. And of the 6 women whose names we know, who were dancing with her at that banquet, 4 of them were family. 2 of them were Boleyns, so her own sister, Mary Boleyn, and Jane Parker, her sister-in-law. But the other 2 were Howards, Elizabeth Howard, Lady Fitzwalter, and Dorothy Howard, the Countess of Derby. Both of them were half-sisters of the Duke of Norfolk, which makes them half-aunts, I think, to Anne, in a weird, roundabout, extremely Tudor way. But they would have been probably a similar kind of age-ish. So I think at this point, it wasn't necessarily about Anne giving greater favour to her own family, because her favour wasn't yet worth all that much. It was the other way round. It was them throwing their weight behind her.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, and that makes sense, because I suppose also, as Anne rose, so did they, but equally, for the Howards in particular, they already had that position that Anne was, that the Boleyns were aspiring to in many respects.
Yeah, kind of. So they've got more to lose than gain in some ways.
Can you tell us about a few sort of particular individuals who made up Anne's household? I think the Madge, the Shelton sisters, for example, are often discussed as sort of quite key figures.
Yeah, and they're often mixed up. So there are 2. There's Margaret Shelton and there's Mary Shelton. Yes, they're around with Anne. I always mix them up as contemporaries, I think, mix them up as well. It's Mary Shelton who hangs out with Mary Howard, Anne's cousin, and Margaret Douglas, the king's niece, and who are responsible for compiling a manuscript that we call the Devonshire manuscript, which is a miscellany of poetry. So it was like a blank book that they passed around their friends and copied in their favourite poems, and then they wrote banter to each other in the margins and, were rude about the men's poetry and things like that. They're a little bit like, in the 1920s, we call the group of young people the Bright Young Things. They're a bit like the Bright Young Things of the 1530s. They're really culturally aware, like they're quoting Chaucer. So clearly they have read this stuff. They know their own English culture, English writing, and French as well. So yes, they're having fun at court and making it glittery as they needed to for Anne. But they weren't the ones who were there super early. So the first women's names that we ever see as being described as with the Lady Anne is on the New Year 1532 list. The king gave gifts to 5 women who were described as being with the Lady Anne. And at top of that list was a woman called Anne Savage, who was the daughter of a knight, Sir John Savage. The Savages had a history of crown service. They're related to the Brereton family. So William Brereton is one of the men who was accused with Anne. Savage was later described by a family servant as a lady of masculine spirit, overpowerful with her husband, seldom at rest with herself. And I think of that and I think, yeah, I can see why maybe she and Anne would have been friends. Yeah, there's a few of those. One of them is called Mistress Marjorie, who might be Marjorie Horsman, who continued in Anne's service even after she married Michael Lister. And she may have been involved in Anne's downfall as well. It's not quite clear. So yeah, there's a number of women who were there quite early on. Another woman I think is interesting is Anne Gainsford. Anne Gainsford was seems to have been a friend of Anne Boleyn. She's one of her ladies in waiting. She's the one who was having a thing with one of the Zouche boys, and he thought it would be funny to steal her copy of William Tyndale's New Testament, and then, of course, was caught. I can't remember who by, Gardner or one of the bishops who was quite conservative, and that is probably how it made its way to the king. And yeah, Anne Gainsford got in trouble for that. But she was also on side when Anne Boleyn received a poison pen drawing of herself beheaded, pronouncing certain destruction if she married the king. And Gainsford is meant to have said, "If I thought it true, though he were an emperor, I would not myself marry him with that condition." And Anne said that she was going to have him whatsoever may become of me. So yeah, there are a number of people who are around Anne. Mary Howard, I also enjoy. She is the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, so she is Anne's first cousin. A little bit younger. Yeah, probably quite a bit younger, because Mary's born in 1519. So she makes her court debut carrying Anne's train when she's made Marquis of Pembroke. And again, that's quite a big Howard statement. Like, the daughter of the Duke is right there next to her. They're all in this now. So be it.
Yeah, now that her position is assured, the Howards suddenly come out of the woodworks.
Absolutely, they do. Yeah.
Another prominent member of Anne Boleyn's household was her sister-in-law, Jane Boleyn. And Jane Boleyn remains a contentious figure for many. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on Anne and Jane's relationship.
To be honest, I don't think they can't have been especially close friends, to be honest, because we know almost nothing at all about the actual nature of their relationship, which might suggest that for most people around, it just wasn't really worthy of comment. I don't think Jane had it in for Anne or anything like that. I just think possibly they were quite different people. And you know, they got on fine, they worked together. But I don't think they were necessarily besties, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because there's that famous scenario, isn't there, where Anne has Jane come on side to sort of almost act, well, they try and figure out who the king is having an affair with, basically, and it ends up with Jane being banished from the court by the king when he finds out.
Yeah, and I think maybe they were similar or slight kindred spirits in that they're both able to quite cynically kind of calculate this stuff and go, right, well, if we want this to happen, then we'll try this, this, here are the pressure points, go. But yeah, maybe they're too similar to be best friends. I don't know.
I think it's just with Jane Boleyn, there's just, you know, she's kind of viewed, isn't she, by many as this sort of evil shrew who brought down her husband and her sister-in-law. And I've never really understood where that comes from, because there just isn't the evidence to support it. And if we think about it logically, whether we like it or not, this was a deeply patriarchal society. Jane Boleyn's position really came via her marriage, and she had been a Boleyn for years. To me, it doesn't make sense that she would have tried to destroy them because she was one of them. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, exactly. She destroys them, she destroys herself, and she nearly did. Yeah, I mean, we can't prove it because we don't know. My hunch would be that when George is arrested, she tries to sue on his behalf and go and see the king like a good wife should. But I think the king isn't seeing anyone. She probably ends up in Cromwell's study. And I mean, how long would you last when you're being questioned by Thomas Cromwell? You know, I think she probably gave away a number of those conversations about impotence and whatnot that she probably didn't mean to. But I mean, God,
totally.
Don't judge till you've walked a mile in their shoes, right? And then by that point, yes, she did provide that evidence, but I don't think she ever meant to breathe it. And possibly, again, Cromwell's not daft, and neither's Jane. He says, you will tell me everything you know, but then I'll make sure you're all right afterwards. And that kind of did happen. He managed to get more money out of her father-in-law for her, and she sailed straight on into Jane Seymour's service and beyond. Yeah,
which is quite telling, I suppose, really, about the fact that this was the wife of a convicted traitor, and yet she reappears at the court by the side of Jane Seymour relatively quickly, it is telling.
Yeah, a little bit.
So once Anne Boleyn became queen, how much did her household increase? I mean, I imagine it would have gone through the roof.
Yeah, I think she would have gone up to the full sort of 100 people you'd expect her to have as a queen. Since we don't know exactly how many she will have had as a marquis, only because she's not the kind of marquis who's living out on her estates. and needing a full household staff. You know, she's in London and at
Mm.
court most of that time. So yeah, I think our household probably would have increased quite a lot. But in many ways, these are previous household servants coming back, and she's just stepping into an existing establishment.
When she became queen, was she given, as part of her position, was she given sort of several properties that were hers in her own right that would have then had households with them as well?
Yeah, they wouldn't have come with households, no, but they would have had probably managers or keepers. Certain palaces have keepers that kind of make sure the place is okay. But yes, she would have had the lands that traditionally were part of the Queen's jointure. And the Queen was the only woman in England who had access to her jointure as soon as she was married. Most other women had to wait to be widowed because the jointure is meant to support you as a widow. But for the Queen, in order for her to live the life to which she's meant to be accustomed, she needs money. And so that's what that is for. Those estates support her.
And I imagine that was very vast in the sort in its both its scale and the amount of revenue that it would bring in.
Yeah, should be. Yeah, and Anne has the reputation of being quite an astute estate manager. She didn't simply hand it all over to her council and say go. She did take an interest.
Can we make sort of comparisons between the scale of her household against Catherine of Aragon's?
To be honest, it would have been about the same. At least
Right.
if we're comparing when Catherine was kind of full queen and in favour, probably broadly the same. Catherine's household does gradually reduce and then reduce quite dramatically during the early 1530s. There wasn't much change in the downstairs part of the Queen's household. A lot of the male staff tend to serve multiple queens, and that's partly because so many of Henry's queens were not raised to the position. They're not princesses, so they don't necessarily know how to do the job. So in some ways, they need that machinery of household around them so they can simply step onto a kind of a running treadmill and off they go, you know?
So one of the sort of the most well-known positions that was part of the king's household was the groom of the stool, and it was, you know, responsible for attending on the king in his most intimate moments. Was there a female version of this, and was that position known as the maiden of the stool, or like was there a female equivalent?
Not that we're aware of.
Okay.
There is a single reference during Elizabeth's reign to Catherine Knowles fulfilling the role of groom of the stool, but it's one single reference. It's not definite, and there's nothing during this earlier period to suggest that the Queen had an equivalent. The groom of the stool is the one who attends the king on the close stool, but he's also the one who runs the privy chamber and has control of the privy purse and things like that. We're not aware of one single female equivalent. It might simply be someone the Queen trusts, but it's not a kind of official position.
Based on the accounts and sort of what you're able to find out, was Anne on good terms with her household staff? Did she maintain strong relationships with sort of everyone?
So far as we know, I'd say yes. It's hard to be sure because a lot of the nice anecdotal evidence comes from after her death, and it comes from people who were seeking to paint her in a positive light. And that's not to say it's rubbish or that they're not right, but it won't. Things like John Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is talking about anyone he considers to have been a Protestant martyr in glowing terms. He's not going to repeat any of the bad gossip he might hear. So he talks about things like she made sure there was an English Bible always open in her chamber for anyone in her household to come and read. She told Mary Shelton off for drawing in her prayer book and things like that. But those are things that are also meant to make her look like a good Protestant, and being good to your servants is a vibe that is part of that. I don't know that Anne necessarily inspired the same kind of loyalty among her ladies in waiting as Catherine of Aragon did, but she'd had a lot less time to do that. There were women who'd served Catherine for, 20 odd years, and simply didn't have time to build those relationships in the same way.
Yeah, and some of those had come with Catherine all the way from Spain, hadn't they, as well? So there was that sort of childhood closeness there as well.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas Anne, she fell out with her sister, didn't she, for a while? So, yeah.
When she fell from favour, obviously in 1536, we discussed a moment ago about Jane Boleyn and how she's sometimes viewed as playing a role in Anne Boleyn's downfall. Were any members of her household absolutely involved in providing evidence against her? And if so, who and what was it they said?
Almost certainly the answer to that is yes. But the depositions for Anne's fall haven't survived. I mean, that's not super surprising because if I was Elizabeth I, I might have burned them too. And we can't prove that that's what happened, but it makes sense. And that means that we don't know for sure who was questioned or who provided evidence, in the way that we do know for Catherine Howard a little bit later, where most of the depositions have survived. But even just looking at those, it does show that, yes, members of her household would have been questioned. We just don't know what they said, which is really annoying. We do know that a lot of the evidence against Anne came from women, and that possibly a woman may have been the first to kind of accidentally give it away. So the Countess of Worcester is supposedly responsible for this. She was heavily pregnant, and her brother, Sir Anthony Browne, who was the King's Master of the Horse, was sort of having a go at her in a way that might suggest he thought the baby wasn't her husband's. And, she's trying to put him off, and she's going, well, you know what? Don't mind me. Look at the Queen. Like, come on, I'm not the worst. And I went, oh no. Which is possible. Anne did mention the Countess of Worcester once she was in the Tower. The Countess of Worcester was apparently so upset at Anne's arrest that her baby hadn't moved since, which, is a very bad sign when you're heavily pregnant. The baby did go on to be born safely and was christened Anne. So that ended okay. But yeah, she may have dropped Anne in it. Other women whose names come up. There's one, Nan Cobham. We still don't know quite who that was. We can't pin it down to any one person in particular. Lady Wingfield as well is really awkward because we think we might know who she was. She might have been Bridget Wiltshire, but in which case she was already dead, probably by that time. So what had she said when she was still alive and why? We get all these kind of half bits and these snippets from various trial reports or ambassadorial reports or things like that. But there's no real clear, it was these people and these are the awful things they said. We just don't know. I'd really like to know what Mary Howard was asked about and what she said, because there's no way she wasn't questioned. But we just don't know.
It's so frustrating, isn't it? Following Anne's execution, what became of her household? Did many of particularly the women that were serving Anne, did they find places in the retinue of Anne's successors? We've mentioned Jane Boleyn, but was this also the case for the other figures of her household?
Not all of them. Anne's household will have been sort of officially disbanded or broken up. Or they sometimes, it's a great word, they say it's been sparkled, which means disbanded. It's a great word. So some will have gone home. Mary Howard went home. So far as we know, she doesn't come back and serve Jane Seymour. Others did. So Jane Boleyn did. So did Marjorie Horsman. A fair few will have come straight into Jane's household. And again, that's partly because the marriage to Jane is so fast that there's not a whole lot of time to recruit a whole new household. So actually, if people are there on site and, willing and ready to serve, then great, crack on. By this point, you need people around the new queen who have experience, because Jane has been a lady in waiting, but probably not for all that long, and she was never raised to be queen. So you need ladies in waiting who can help make sure she doesn't put her foot wrong and things like that. I think Jane Boleyn was probably one of those. And a lot of the downstairs household will simply have carried on. There's one gentleman usher whose name crops up again and again and again and again. And I keep meaning when I have time to investigate him a little bit more and see if I can find out who he was and where he came from and this thing. His name's Henry Webb, and he pops up constantly. He's one of the messengers that Catherine Howard is using to send illicit messages to Thomas Culpeper and things. And I just think, my God, the things he must have seen and heard. But he serves certainly 5 of 6 queens. It might even be 6. I'm not sure if I've seen him under Catherine Parr's lists. But yeah, I think there must have been a number of people like him who just go, all right, another one, carry on. Um,
Yeah, it's like swinging saloon doors of queens.
well, it becomes a bit like that. Like we so often think six wives, oh, they must be evenly spaced, but they're really not. The turnover is so quick.
I know. I mean, that's what, when you consider as well that, Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon for more than double, literally more than double the amount of time that the other five wives he was married to combined. It's remarkable, really.
Yeah, Catherine of Aragon's half the
Yeah,
reign. The others,
it's
meh.
crazy. It's crazy. But
Yeah.
yeah, and that's, I think, something that people often overlook about Jane Boleyn as well, is that she also, she was privy to so much. She served, we know she served the first five queens.
Yeah.
So it's she's another
Yeah.
one who will have seen it all, and I think that's what's so fascinating about her.
Yeah, absolutely. Which makes it even harder to know what on earth was going on during Catherine Howard's reign. Like, I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, part of me does wonder with that if it's just Occam's razor of the simplest answer, and that Catherine was queen, she was following,
Yep.
and the queen requested it of her. She was the queen's servant. She was following orders. Part of me wonders if it is literally that straightforward. She was following orders from the queen.
I think it could well be that Jane accidentally stumbled across something, saw
Mm,
something, and then sort of, I suppose, became implicated from that point,
yeah.
really.
I don't buy
Um,
into the whole like she was living vicariously through them or anything like that.
no, that doesn't make sense to me
No, but
either.
I think it's either. Well, as I say, I would sort of summarise that she was just following orders, but nonetheless it is. There must have been a moment where she was thinking, "What the fuck are you doing?" Like this is, she would have known that it was the not a good thing for the queen to be doing.
Yeah, yeah, and I think she
Yeah,
must have been frightened. I think it might be a good example of how sometimes things
yeah,
could just snowball. And again, people in the past are also capable of making bad decisions or
mm,
just poor judgment calls when they're between a rock and a hard
totally.
place. So yeah.
Totally. Well, finally, is there a member of Anne's household who, in your opinion, is just really overlooked by history and actually played quite a large role in Anne's life, but for whatever reason we just don't know very much about?
My money would be on Mary Howard, and it's not that she's necessarily wholly overlooked, but it's that she does quite a number of interesting things, particularly during Anne's reign. So she's the one who is signifying Howard's support when Anne is made Marquess of Pembroke in 1532, because she carries her train. And she's quite young at this point. She's only in her teens, so it must have been quite nerve-wracking. Um, she's very close friends with the king's niece, Margaret Douglas, who is the daughter of his older sister, Margaret, who's Queen of Scotland.
Mm,
And that leads her into some trouble, I guess. She makes some questionable decisions that you could see that this is perhaps for the benefit of her family, but her family don't agree, and the king certainly doesn't agree. So she helps Margaret Douglas to secretly marry one of her own Howard cousins, Thomas Howard. He's a younger son. He's the youngest half brother of the Duke of Norfolk, which in noble terms is
mm.
as close to being nobody as you're going to get. And obviously by the standards of the general population, he's still pretty damn, elite and noble. But among the nobility, he's got nothing of his own. And Margaret
Yeah, he's a
Douglas
nobody.
marries him secretly with Mary Howard's connivance. And then she keeps their secret. And then it all falls apart in July 1536. And the king is just aghast because he's just executed Anne Boleyn. He's just illegitimized Princess Elizabeth and Princess Mary. And so Margaret Douglas's importance to the succession rises very suddenly. And then they find out she's thrown herself away on a nobody. And I think if Mary Howard hadn't been
Mm,
married to Henry Fitzroy, who was the king's illegitimate son, she might have found herself in some danger. But there were rumours at the same time that the king was
really?
thinking of making Henry Fitzroy his heir. Fitzroy himself then dies unexpectedly. But I mean, perhaps that's a sign the king may have been thinking along those lines, because you can't really convict your sort of queen in waiting, if you will, for high treason. And it would just have been very messy if he'd done anything about Mary's role. And so she pretty much got away with it, which is really the story of Mary's life. she does that again and again.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. This was such a fascinating discussion. This was a request from one of my followers, and it's definitely a subject I think we don't know enough about, and it's really interesting to hear what you've had to say about Anne's household. So yeah, thanks so much again for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. My thanks to Dr. Nikki Clark for coming onto the show and discussing Anne Boleyn's household with us. In addition to this, my main episode, I also release a weekly subscriber-only episode via Patreon or Apple Podcast subscriptions. To access this, just head to patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts. Thank you for listening to the show and speak soon.